Local Cluster of Stars by Elton Gar. It was 6:37 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and Andrea was sipping coffee, trying to stay awake after a long, boring night of watching the sky. Then the message appeared on the monitor in green text. Still half asleep, it took her several seconds to fathom the meaning of the message. It read in clear English, "You're not supposed to be here." Andrea watched the message for several seconds. She had spent her entire life feeling like she wasn't supposed to be anywhere. It was why she had spent her life seeking something bigger than herself. Then, as it began to sink in, she slowly and mechanically began to check the results. Focusing on the finer details was nearly impossible. But after checking everything 3 times, either someone who was much smarter than her was playing a joke, or this hadn't been sent by humans. She considered how to continue for a full minute. She had wanted this since long before she started working here, and now she was terrified. The procedure was simple. She would shut down all external communication and contact Ted, who would come in, and contact people who Andrea wasn't allowed to even know the names of. That seemed wrong to her. The lockdown in communications was obvious because they intended to hide any discoveries. But no matter what came next, everyone deserved to know. So she transmitted the information to several of the smartest people she knew. She didn't tell them what it was or why she needed them to check it, only that it needed to be done fast. If it was an alien signal, they wouldn't need to be told, and if it wasn't, no one would blame her because she had made no claims. While the data was uploading, she called Ted, her boss. He lived an hour's drive away, and not including the time he took to curse at her for waking him up, and after making her repeat herself 4 times, he made it to the observatory in under 30 minutes. He wasn't wearing shoes, and struggled to see the monitors because he had forgotten his glasses. But after making her read the data because he couldn't see it, he pushed her out of the way, taking her place at the screen and said, "Get me some coffee." She poured him a cup of coffee, and as she handed it to him, he said, "You seem to have gotten most of this right this time. You still should have waited for me to get here. We don't need someone making stupid mistakes." Andrea didn't know what mistake he thought she could have made. The only thing she had done while waiting for him was to copy the data into a backup. She had also sent the data out, but if he knew she had done that, he'd be screaming at her again, not giving her backhanded compliments. Andrea let Ted take over as people began to respond to the data with excitement and ideas about what to do next. Ted dismissed several Andrea thought would work, but then he had a master's degree and she didn't. While he was poking holes in yet another simple suggestion, a second message appeared. It read, "Apologies for formulation of previous communication. Vessel AI not programmed for introductory interaction. Emotions are pleasure and astonishment at finding unpredictable intelligence on the celestial body, designated as Garden. We arrive soon. Time duration not translated for correct date. Soon. More will be explained as translation enlarged." Andrea read it 3 times before she was confident that she understood it. It seemed to be a peaceful greeting. Ted was less convinced, but he didn't have time to explain why her interpretation was stupid, as he was called away to explain to the President of the United States why their receiver couldn't send a message to the aliens. While he did, Andrea adjusted the link to the satellites in the most basic of the several ways people had suggested, and then typed, "Greetings from a single member of the human species. The best measure of interstellar distance we have is the distance that light can travel. Our simplest to understand measure of time is the time taken for our planet to orbit our star. A more specific time would be helpful to prevent panic." As she hit the button to send, Andrea doubted it would work, but it wouldn't hurt anything. Then, as the data was transmitted, she realized it was working and could only hope to be fired and not executed for treason, but she had dealt with bureaucracy before and didn't think waiting a week to send a bland, non-committal response was a good idea. Luckily, everyone was too busy to notice the barely notable signal sent back towards the aliens. Then, about 10 minutes later, there was a return signal on the exact frequency that Andrea had used. It said, "It is admirable your species has sufficient scientific and cultural width to interpret concept light speed. Also, pleasure in recognition of the personal freedom allowed an individual to communicate without fear of punishment. We acknowledge the peril of knowing our beingness. It is recorded that those species who are unplanned are fearful of the unknown. Transition from alone to many is difficult. We ask you not to use crude atomic munition in response to arrival. They would damage you, not us. Assuming calculations of orbit are correct, we will arrive in time it takes for your planet to orbit your star 1/4 of rotation. We ask for communication to continue and will answer questions. A quarter rotation would be 3 months. That was hardly any time at all, but it was better than hours. And there were plenty of questions. For Andrea, they had answered the most important. She probably wouldn't be executed. It also suggested they might understand humans better than their language skills suggested. But since they had asked for questions and she was at the keyboard, she typed, "Does your species plan intelligence?" The response was faster than before. It read, "In a way, as do many others. We are what you might call farmers. We created this local cluster of stars and helped foster life on many planets. We anticipated 123,000 orbits more before intelligence would begin in this part of the cluster. You have birthed yourself well ahead of schedule and on the wrong planet. This suggests existence of knowledge we did not previously have. This excites us. We hope this answer aids in your understanding." Andrea wasn't sure what to think. The scope was absurd. Species seeding life and waiting for it to evolve would take millions or billions of years. But while there were people who were reading the incoming messages, none of them had figured out who they were responding to. That wouldn't take them long, but in the minutes that she had, Andrea asked a follow-up question. "Can you clarify the phrase local cluster of stars? We use the term solar system for a single star and the planets around it, and galaxy for all the stars that orbit a central location that we believe to be collapsed stars. We believe there are about 10 billion stars in our galaxy. We use a base 10 number system, and a billion is 10 digits deep." The response took no more time than before, but the answer was considerably more astonishing. It responded, "We understand the confusion. Your species is young and knows only what can be done by the astonishingly young. Both words solar system and galaxy are useful measurements. The term local cluster of stars refers to those created about 13.7 billion orbits of your planet before the current time. You should not be ashamed if you believe this to be all there is, as you cannot see beyond it." Ted was still holding the phone that presumably had the President of the United States on it, and leaning close to the screen so he could read it. As he saw the conversation, he sat missing the chair and sitting on the floor and dropping the phone. Ted picked up the phone and mumbled something, then pushed a button, and the crackling voice of the President of the United States said over the speakerphone, "Did they just say they created the universe?" "Yes, they did," Andrea said, then added, "though the term universe would be inaccurate. Perhaps the local cluster of stars is more accurate." Andrea looked down at Ted, who was still muttering something to himself, and then she took a sip of coffee, and feeling far more confident than she ever felt while Ted was in the room, she typed, "I do not think you will have answered all of our questions before you arrive. My job is to expand intelligence to all planets in this cluster of stars. Your appearance is the current top priority. We expect 123,000 orbits of your planet around the local star before we will be needed elsewhere. That should be sufficient time to get you started." Andrea glanced down at her boss. He was muttering something. Well, perhaps she was an unimportant person on a backwards planet on the edge of space, but who better to meet them? So she said, "I'll be there to meet you." And for the first time in her life, Andrea felt as if she were exactly where she was meant to be.
Author's note: there are a lot of things about science fiction that I love, but one thing that I've never gotten over is the ability of science fiction to express the scale of the universe. The best science fiction understands just how big things are. Whether it is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy reminding us that the galaxy is big, really big, or the episodes of Star Trek when you're reminded that after hundreds of years of exploration they have barely begun, it's always exciting to see just how much there is. It's also humbling, to the point of being almost crushing, the understanding of just how tiny we are. That every person who has ever lived and died has done so on a tiny speck of dust. So that's what this story is. My attempt to explain to people just how small we all are, and to remind everyone that it doesn't mean we aren't important or uninteresting. Because in a universe as massive as ours, there are a nearly infinite number of stars, planets, nebulae, galaxies, and all the rest. But so far as we know, there is nothing exactly like any of us. If you've enjoyed this, I have a newsletter where you can not only get free stories similar to this one every week, but you can get a free novel when you sign up. Just go to www.ansci-fi.com and look for the link that reads free book. You can also get audio versions of my stories at www.youtube.com/@ansci-fi. Or if you really want to help, you can join my Patreon, www.patreon.com/Elton, And besides being a huge help to me, you'll get access to all of my short stories, including Patreon exclusives, and get to vote on what patron exclusive stories I write. Thanks. Elton Gar.